The New York Times reported last week that on July 7, 3 days into the emergency response effort, FEMA call centers responded to less than 20% of the calls coming in from disaster victims for help. That means more than 4 out of 5 calls went unanswered. And I can just imagine the frustration of people looking for loved ones, dealing with damage, dealing with incredible tragedy to find out that their government just wasn't answering the phone.
What's up, everybody? Major Retired Richard Ojeda here. And have you ever tried calling a phone number and never get to talk to anyone? You know what I'm talking about. Maybe you're stuck on hold trying to make an airline reservation or put into a penalty box of sorts, just sitting there listening to music that gets crappier by the moment, and you start practicing the things that you're going to blast the agent with when they finally come on the line? Yeah, I think we've all been there. The frustration of being ignored crosses boundaries and doesn't discriminate. It has happened to all of us at one point or another. Now imagine that you've just been flooded out. Your legislators voted against warning sirens that could have helped out in the flood, that just devastated your community, and nobody seems to be taking you seriously. Imagine trying to get through to FEMA for help, because that's what the agency is supposed to do. Federal Emergency Management. But what it's turned into is just a skeleton staff that can't keep up with the demands and fails to answer the calls of the people that they're supposed to be helping through a major disaster. What happens to the people, the folks who've lost everything and need help? Do the victims of natural disasters get pushed aside in the great state of Texas? Get offered thoughts and prayers by the governor and excuse after excuse from the department that's supposed to be helping? Being ignored by a neighbor, coworker, or some random jackaloon isn't the worst that could happen. But what happens when you're asking for your own government for help, pointing out the facts of the matter and getting told that it's all fake news, according to Kristi Noem, director of the DHS?
Secretary Noem, however, claimed that on Meet the Press that the New York Times piece was, quote, fake news.
New York Times is reporting that thousands of calls from flood victims to FEMA call centers went unanswered in the middle of this ongoing disaster because you didn't renew contracts to keep call center staff in place until nearly 1 week after the floods. Why did it take so long to extend those contracts?
It's just false. Those contracts were in place.
It didn't take 5 days?
No employees were off of work. Every one of them was answering calls. So false reporting, fake news, and it's discouraging.
Absolutely crazy scenario that Kristi Noem is involved in. Again, her incompetence and disregard of everything that's right should be a deal breaker for MAGA. But for many, it's just another opportunity to cry foul and try to blame someone else for the mess they created.
Isn't it accurate that 80% of, at least, of the calls that went to FEMA call centers on July 7th went unanswered?
When the tragedy struck, we knew there would be a
simple yes or no question. They either answered the calls or they didn't answer the calls on July 7th.
When there was a spike in calls, FEMA was there to answer the calls. The majority of the calls were answered at the call centers.
Well, that's not what the report says. The report says that that on July 5th, as the floodwaters were starting to recede, FEMA received 3,027 calls from disaster survivors and answered 3,018 of them, which is over 99%. Contractors with 4 call center companies answered the vast majority of the calls. That evening, however, Ms. Noem did not renew the contracts with those 4 companies, and hundreds of contractors were fired, according to the documents and the person briefed on the matter. The next day, July 6th, FEMA received 2,363 calls and answered 846, or roughly 35.8%, according to those documents. And on Monday, July 7th, the agency fielded 16,419 calls and answered 2,613 of them, which is only 15.9%. That's shown by official documents.
That was what happened in a recent hearing where Representative Friedman absolutely dismantled acting FEMA Director David Richardson and left him squirming like a slug in a salt factory. The gall that these people have to misrepresent the facts, lie about the outcomes, and disregard the human suffering of their own constituents is dumbfounding and unacceptable. FEMA, America's last line of defense in a disaster, left people on hold while their homes were underwater, and then had the audacity to deny it ever happened. Inexcusable, and in the middle of a life-threatening crisis, families were frantically trying to reach FEMA for help, for rescue, for shelter, for answers, and the agency's own data shown that in some cases only 15% of the calls were answered. Yet instead of owning that failure, cosplay Kristi Noem told Meet the Press that those numbers were fake news. Fake news, huh? Wonder where she got that. She doesn't have an original idea in her body. That's not just bureaucratic failure, that's moral failure. Americans are suffering. FEMA failed, and the people responsible are gaslighting the public while shifting blame and dodging accountability. This is a story of human devastation weaponized for political cover, and Representative Laura Friedman was the only one in the room with the guts to call it out. They promised FEMA would be ready. They promised emergency response would be quick. They promised transparency and accountability. And then, when the water rose and the calls came in, they vanished. Imagine the desperation, people looking for loved ones, dealing with damage, dealing with incredible tragedy, to find out that their government just wasn't answering the phone. And just like that, the MAGA promise of a leaner, meaner government collapsed into chaos. They wanted to dismantle the deep state. Congratulations. Now the phones don't even ring. They want you to believe that they're protecting you, that FEMA is ready, that your government will show up when disaster strikes. And what does Kristi Noem do when confronted with this brutal fact? She yanks the GOP emergency parachute and screams, "Fake news!" Meanwhile, real people are sitting in mold-ridden homes, phones in hand, waiting for help that's not coming. But sure, let's pretend this is all some liberal fantasy cooked up by coastal elites with soy milk in their coffee and clipboards full of CRT panic. This is the playbook now. Lie, deny, blame the press. Your house is underwater. That's not FEMA's fault. It's the media's fault for reporting on it. Kristi Noem isn't protecting you. She's protecting the illusion that everything's fine. And when the lies get exposed, her only move is to gaslight the American people. Again.
A little while ago, you said that part of your job you felt was to remove, you called them bureaucratic, closing out bureaucratic procedures. To me, having someone, one person only, having to sign off on every contract of $100,000 or more is the definition of bureaucracy. And in this case, it led to thousands of victims not having their calls answered by their government. Their government wasn't there when they reached out for help in their darkest hour. So are those numbers fake? Are you telling me that those are fake numbers, or are they verifiable, and did Ms. Noem misspeak when she said that it was fake news?
What I can tell you is the vast majority of phone calls were answered. There was never a lapse in the contract. Secretary Noem, under her leadership, she's concerned about due diligence and making sure the American people get what they deserve.
So in your
for
mind,
the tax dollars.
15.9% of calls being answered is the vast majority? So is that the benchmark now we're looking for FEMA to answer their calls? 15%, or in one case, 35% in a day, in the middle of this disaster, this huge disaster?
I would have to agree with Secretary Noem. That's fake news. The majority of the calls were answered. There was never a lapse in contract.
Well, that is absolutely not what the reports from these companies from the disaster says. They give specific numbers of calls that went unanswered, and I don't see how you can deny these reports, but I will yield my time back.
So are those numbers fake? That's the question Representative Friedman asked point blank. And that New York Times report, the one with the data verified from government contractors, is just inventing stats out of thin air. That's not a partisan question. That's a hard number. That's math. And yet, when David Richardson was cornered with that reality, when he had the chance to clear it up, to be honest with the public, he went full gaslight mode. What I can tell you is the vast majority of phone calls were answered. There was never a lapse in the contract. The contract, huh? Is that enough to tell you that this response is profit-based? The contract, not the duty to the American people? Wow, talk about his true colors shining through. That's the GOP emergency playbook in action. If reality doesn't help you, just say something else. Forget the victims, forget the footage, forget the facts. Pretend that families weren't stranded. Pretend that FEMA didn't fail. Just say the vast majority were answered and hope nobody asks any follow-ups. But Representative Friedman did, and she called it what it was, a lie, a dodge, and a daggone disgrace. Folks, at the end of the day, just look at all the folks out there that needed FEMA and aren't getting nothing. A lot of people have been calling for FEMA, and they haven't been doing their job because at the end of the day, Kristi Noem is more focused on trying to make sure we're building places like Alligator Alcatraz so she can come and daggle around and play dress up like she's a friggin' ICE agent. That's what she cares about, more than taking care of people who are going through disasters. And I'm going to tell you the main reason why they're cutting all these places off, because they're just waiting. They're waiting because what they really want is to look Gavin Newsom in the face when the wildfire starts again, because they always do out there. And oh, by the way, if you've never been to California, if you're in Beverly Hills and places like that, sure, you see beautiful manicured lawns and green everything. But outside of those areas, California is scorched earth. It's dry everywhere, and when the fire catches, it spreads fast. But this is what they're doing. They're more than willing to tell everybody in America, no, we don't want to help you, just so when the time comes and the wildfires hit California, Donald Trump and his bootlickers can say, no, we're not going to do for you, Gavin Newsom. And if California decided not to send a single damn dime to Washington, D.C., guess what? West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Louisiana, South Carolina, you're going to go under. So get ready. Watch these people who are trying to pick a fight they have no clue how to finish. Gavin Newsom runs California, and California is like the 5th or 6th largest economy on the face of the earth. California's economy is bigger than almost every single country out there. So make no mistakes about it. California will be just fine. They've got the money, the resources, the leadership. But what about the rest of us? What about the forgotten communities in Appalachia, the Gulf Coast, the Midwest, who get the floods, the fires, the tornadoes, and then get nothing but a shrug from the governments that's supposed to help them survive it? While MAGA plays political games and cosplays as border agents, the real emergencies are being ignored. At the end of the day, when you're staring at a wrecked home, a flooded street, or a missing family member, all you want is help. But instead, all you get is a busy signal, a bureaucratic shuffle, or worse, another lie to cover up the last one. That's not leadership, that's a travesty. Kristi Noem is unqualified, unprepared, and completely out of her depth. She doesn't know her job, she can't do her job, and FEMA under her so-called watch is circling the drain right alongside her political career. She should resign in disgrace before American disaster turns into another American tragedy. And that is an absolute fact. Sappers clear the way, airborne all the way.